What if I told you that you could get into law school without taking the LSAT? No logical reasoning, no reading comprehension, no test day pressure, just you apply and you get in. That idea used to be a fantasy and now it's technically allowed. Recently, the American Bar Association voted to allow law schools to apply for permission to admit students without requiring a standardized test like the LSAT. So it is true now that, yes, in theory, a law school can admit you without an LSAT score, but here's the uncomfortable truth. This change sounds bigger than it actually is. And if you misunderstand how it works, you could make a strategic mistake that costs you scholarships, leverage, or realistic chances of admission. So let's slow this down and look at what actually changed and what absolutely did not. The American Bar Association did not remove the LSAT requirement. Instead, they introduced a mechanism called a variance. A variance is special permission. It is an exception granted on a case by case basis. What the American Bar Association is now saying is if a law school wants to experiment with admitting some students without a standardized test, it may apply for that exception, but the school still has to explain how it will evaluate applicants, how it will maintain academic standards, and how it will track outcomes like GPA performance, attrition, and bar passage rates. Then we will decide whether to allow it. If the school's request is approved, it gets permission for a limited period of time, usually 3 to 5 years. After that, one of three things happens. The school reapplies, the ABA denies renewal of its request, or the school reverts to traditional test required admissions. And so this structure tells you something important. The ABA is just gathering data here. This is not a mandate, it's not automatic, it's not universal, and it's definitely not permanent. No law school is required to participate in the new test optional regime. No school is guaranteed approval to go test optional, and no law school can abandon standardized testing indefinitely under this rule. And all of this matters because it explains why the LSAT is still very much alive. Even after this change, the LSAT remains deeply embedded in how law schools operate. The first big factor is the US News rankings. Rankings still reward schools for high LSAT medians. They reflect prestige, applicant quality, alumni donations, and employer perception. Schools aren't casually going to give any of that up. The second big factor is scholarship. Law LSAT scores are not just tools for getting you into law school, they're also tools for getting you discounts on your tuition. Merit scholarships are largely allocated based on LSAT-driven competition. If you've got a strong LSAT score, it's not just getting you in, it's often determining whether you pay sticker price for tuition or you graduate with minimal debt. If you remove the LSAT as a factor, the schools lose one of their cleanest ways to justify merit-based aid. This means scholarships become harder to access and more discretionary. Now, the third big factor is risk management. Law schools are judged in part by the bar passage rates of their graduating students. If their graduates fail the bar in large numbers, their ABA accreditation is threatened. Now, the LSAT is, of course, imperfect, but it still is one of the strongest predictors for first-year performance and bar passage rates. Schools are not eager to give up on predictive tools like the LSAT unless they're confident they have replacements, which they currently don't. Now, there are two forces pushing the ABA to experiment anyway with going LSAT optional. The first big force is access and optics. The LSAT has long been criticized for favoring applicants with time, with money, and access to high-quality prep resources. And that criticism isn't wrong. Every standardized test reflects socioeconomic disparities. The ABA wants to test whether alternative admissions frameworks can reduce barriers without harming outcomes. The second big factor is enrollment pressure. Law schools are mostly tuition-driven institutions. And there are long-term demographic trends that suggest there are going to be fewer applicants in the future due to the demographic cliff. Fewer people graduating college, fewer people applying to law school. That puts these institutions under threat. And so test optional policies are going to widen the funnel, allowing them to source more applicants. More applicants means more tuition revenue and more flexibility for schools that are struggling to fill seats. And of course, the ABA is not making this change in isolation. There are many other graduate and professional programs that have already gone test optional. And so legal education is actually just catching up. It's a bit behind the times, but they want to do so cautiously, of course. Now, the top tier schools, the T14, the Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and so on, they are more elite programs that are still constrained by their rankings and maintaining their reputations. And so they might admit a small number of students without LSAT scores, but those are often non-traditional applicants with extraordinary backgrounds. The majority of admits, though, are still going to have strong LSAT scores. Then you have the lower ranked schools that are constrained by bar passage requirements. Those schools can't afford to admit large cohorts without predictive metrics. The LSAT still remains their safest tool to make sure they are admitting students who are likely to pass the bar and likely to get employment upon graduation. But then you have those mid-tier schools, which is where most of the experimentation is going to happen, but they're going to do so carefully. So they might have some limited slots for test optional students. They're still definitely going to require strong GPAs, and they're going to have a preference for students with more rigorous majors in undergrad. They're going to prefer non-traditional or part-time applicants if they are going test optional, and they're going to track outcomes closely. And so these schools are going to test small at first. They're going to measure outcomes aggressively, and they will expand only if the results justify it. Now, here's what almost no headline explains. Going test optional doesn't make it easier to get in. In fact, it makes your application more risky because with no LSAT score, your GPA is going to matter more. Where you went to undergrad is going to matter more. Your application essays are going to matter more. Same goes for your letters of rec. Same goes for your resume. And if any of those are merely good instead of exceptional, you lose that margin for error. And your scholarship negotiation leverage is going to drop severely. The LSAT gives schools permission to invest in you financially because you applying with a strong LSAT helps them in the rankings and helps them mitigate their risk around whether you are going to pass the bar, whether you're going to get employment, whether you're going to succeed in 1L. And so without the LSAT score, they rely more on subjective judgment, which of course is riskier. And so they're going to favor safer and cheaper admits. And so if you are applying to law school anytime in the next 5-10 years, the rational move, the safe move is to not bet on the LSAT disappearing. Instead, think about it this way. The LSAT is still the most powerful variable you control. Your GPA is probably pretty fixed at this stage, but your LSAT score is not because you can, of course, study more, you can retake. If you have a strong LSAT score, you can expand your school list, you improve your scholarship odds, you reduce your risk of not getting in somewhere good, and it maintains your leverage in one of the most competitive cycles in recent memory. So test optional is just a recent experiment, but the LSAT is your leverage. And in a competitive zero-sum competition, leverage is everything. So ignore the headlines, take the LSAT, do well, and use your LSAT advantage while it still clearly exists.